So welcome to our hybrid and recorded program in the genealogy series from Spartanburg County Public Libraries. My name is Charity Rouse. I am the Director of Local History and Genealogy Services here at the Spartanburg County Public Library System. And we're going to take a look at wills, estates, and probate records, how to find them, what the types of things you can find in those records might be. And these are representative of primarily Spartanburg County records, but other records are going to be similar, although the indexing may work a little differently. But we'll talk about that. So, okay. The biggest thing is, what is a will? Well, a will is the official testament of someone as to what they want done with their land, money, and other belongings. It is a legally binding document if it is witnessed and registered correctly. So sometimes you see a will being registered and one of the witnesses says, I never signed that document. I didn't witness that. So it can be contested. Often the will, obviously it is written before the person dies. Sometimes it is dictated on their deathbed. Sometimes it is written well in advance. So look at the timeline, look at what the date is on the will to see how current it is. And if it is found in personal effects, know that it may or may not be the registered version of the will. The registered version is going to appear in the court record, in whichever court handles probate. In South Carolina, that's the probate court. So, what is probate? What does that mean? Well, it is the official process of dealing with the estate of a deceased person through the courts. There is a second level of court that also can be, records can be found in, and that would be, in South Carolina, we call that equity court. In Virginia, it's called chancery court. Probate court will send it to those, or they may be a subset or a subcourt of the probate court in that area. But it also just may be part of the circuit court's process. So again, time and place, like all genealogical records, time, place, and location can change what you're looking at and looking for. There are some other names that I have seen. Pennsylvania, I believe, at least at one point, ran this through orphans court. So, because they were dealing with guardianships of the minor children and of the women who had fewer legal rights of the husband who is deceased. So again, if you've got questions about Idaho, I'm not an expert in Idaho. It's too far west. I've only worked as far west as Kansas. So you may be able to find information on the Family Search Wiki on what court name you want to look at and look for. So also just know that due to heirs under the age of 21, outstanding debts, money owed to the deceased, and other considerations, probate can sometimes take years. So in the examples that I'm given in a little bit, we will see some examples where probate does take 30 or 40 years. It just happens that way. So, does every person have a will and or probate file? Short answer, no. This can depend on the laws of the time period and the location. It can also depend on record destruction. Sometimes courthouses do burn, flood, etc. And unlike deeds, probate is typically in one place. Deeds, which we'll talk about next month, the buyer, the seller, and the court all have copies of that deed. So sometimes they get re-registered if there is a disaster at the courthouse. So, is the person who you are researching someone who owns property? real property, i.e. real estate, or personal property, things like horses, mules, watches, etc. Do they have a savings account at the bank? Those types of things. Do they have stock? Also, pre-1865, did they own enslaved persons? So there is a wide variety of property that can be part of an estate. Males with families are more likely to have probate. Although if you are the wealthy great uncle and you die without heirs and without direct heirs and without a will, everybody in the family is going to want a piece of that one. So the court will be involved in how to divide up the property. If it is a female, is she single or widowed? Single and widowed women sometimes have better rights during certain time periods to be able to have say over what happens to their property along the way. Are there significant debts to others? If someone dies owing a large amount of money, there is likely to be a probate because the people want to, holding the debt, they want to get their money back. So they are going to sometimes go to a chancery court or to a equity court and say, if probate court says, well, they don't have anything, we don't need to do a probate, the debtors will probably go to one of those other courts and say, hey, I want my money. Now, you can't really collect from somebody who has nothing, but you can try. Was the death expected or unexpected? If the death is expected, there is more likely to be a will. If someone dies in their 30s and they haven't been sick, it's a freak accident, their horse threw them or whatever, they are less likely to have a will. If they are someone who owns more items, more property, lots of acreage or something like that, they are more likely to have a will. So it all depends on who they are and what their status in life is. So, and again, all of the documents didn't survive, but a lot of them did, and more of them did than we sometimes think. So, some brief definitions. I know you want to get to those documents, you want to see the records, but we got to talk about what some of these things mean. A testament, a last will and testament. It's another term for a will. A testator or testatrix is one who makes a will, the person who's devising their property, giving away, telling everybody they want this child to have $1, or they want this child to have their house. Testate, it means you died with a legally valid will that can be produced and handed to the judge and said, this is properly witnessed. The witnesses can be interviewed and they say, yes, I saw so-and-so write this will, or I was there when they orally dictated this will and it was written down. And so it is a legally valid will. Intestate, not interstate, intestate means you die without a will. And so at that point, the court has to be involved, at least to the point of deciding whether a probate is appropriate or not. Do you have enough that they have to probate? And there are different amounts of money that are legally binding for that at different times. So again, that's going to vary in the time and place. Administrator, male. Administratrix, female. The person or persons appointed by the court to administrate a probate where no executor was named. So in many wills, it will name, I would like to have my wife Polly be executor of my will, my son-in-law Joe, my neighbor Sam. If no one is named, then the judge and the court have to name someone to be the person who shepherds the process through on the family, on behalf of the deceased. So the executor or executrix, again, male and female, it's Latin, is the person named by the testator or testatrix and approved by the court to carry out the instructions in the will. And there are legal ramifications if you are appointed administrator or you are agreed to be the executor, or just read the male and female when I talk about that, because it's a big mouthful. But if you agree to those positions, there are legal ramifications and monetary ramifications if you do not follow through. So there's a bond that has to happen. So other things to consider: time frame and location. Women's rights have changed wildly over the last couple of centuries. Practices and laws can differ from state to state. This is most apparent in those states like Louisiana that came from French tradition, Florida, Texas that came from Spanish tradition, as well as most of the original colonies came from the British tradition of law. And so there are a lot of similarities there, but some states are a little different than others. So again, research a little bit of the background of the time and place that you are looking at so that you know what to ask for and what to expect. You may find your ancestor as a witness, a court official, a guardian, beneficiary, someone who's inheriting, a purchaser of items being sold at an estate sale, as well as being the person who is deceased. So, you know, don't just look for the name. If you're reading a document for a neighbor, your person may appear. So that's always a good thing to read through. And you may find an earlier version of a will, which is not the official testament validated in probate. And one of the things is, if you know that you have a will that is dated 1862 for someone who was serving in the military in the Civil War, then you know also that they died in 1910. You know that there's probably a will after 1862 if they died in 1910. And so you do need to look at things. I had a situation where someone brought in this wonderful 1860 whatever will that was written by someone going off to serve in the military in the Civil War, and devised a whole bunch of property, including enslaved persons, to various people. But they said, but I've got his will, but he died in 19 whatever. And so we looked up and we discovered that he had an actual valid will written post-war that actually was what was legally valid and binding. But that earlier will was really interesting and informative on the family level, because it also helped break through some walls for some of the descendants of some of those enslaved mentioned. So again, just because it's not a legal tool in the court, it may have useful information for you. Now, the wills and probates are most often filed in the county where the person died. You may also find notations or copies of them in a county where they own significant property. So sometimes if County A that they lived in is a burned county, you might find copies of these things in County B where they owned significant land. That might be South Carolina and Mississippi. So, especially for people who owned large amounts of land in the mid-1800s, look for, did they own property in other states? Because those records may have survived, and there may have been a clerk-to-clerk copy sent to register, because they had to register the transfer of the property that was in that state as well as in South Carolina. So, also note the age of children. If there are children under the age of 21, there's more likely to be probate and guardianship of those children. Women could be guardians of their children for purposes of education and raising and taking them to church and things, but often, pre-Civil War, roughly, they could not be the financial guardian of their children. They had to have a next friend or someone else, father, brother, whoever, who could be the financial guardian for the children and often for themselves. Women's rights have come a long way, but remember, it was in the 1970s before a woman could get a credit card in her own name. So, things change. You got to learn what the law says at the time to know. So, where do you find these wills and probate records? The courthouse or clerk of court's office, if it is not in the courthouse. Some have online access, but many have no distance access. So if you want something from Spartanburg County Probate Court, you physically have to go down to Spartanburg County Probate Court if it is in the 20th century or 21st century. Up to 1900 has been microfilmed, and we have Spartanburg County microfilm here. It's also online on Family Search, but that stops in 1900. That's 122 years ago. So we got a little bit of catching up to do. So just know, you may have to hire a researcher to go to that courthouse if you can't get here to go. I mentioned at the library on microfilm, we do also have printed abstracts and transcriptions of some periods of these records. And that's going to vary county by county depending on the volunteers who did these transcripts and abstracts. Transcript is full text, abstract is, we pulled out the highlights for you. FamilySearch.org is fantastic. Ancestry also has many of these records now. FamilySearch digitized from microfilm, and they had 2.5 million rolls of microfilm to digitize. They have now digitized all of it, but about 500,000 rolls of microfilm still have copyright issues, shall we say. And so not all of them are online on Family Search. Some of them you have to be at a Family Search affiliate library like us, or at a family history center at one of the local Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints stakes. And so it's a mixed bag. Now, you can't search most of these by name because they do not have the transcriptions of the indexing connected with the images for all of these 2 million rolls of microfilm that are now available online. It's a big project. They've got a lot of people working on it. You can volunteer, but just know you can't always search by name from that front page of Family Search. You may have to go to the catalog and find Spartanburg County and look for probate records, and then go page by page through this in the process that I'm going to be talking about in a minute, so that you can find the image and the information you're looking for. Now, also look at the state or regional archive or library. They may have some scanned from their collection. In South Carolina, our main repository is the South Carolina Department of Archives and History in Columbia. In Virginia, you want to look at the Library of Virginia. Different states designate different places. In Kansas, it's the Kansas Historical Society. So they call it different things, and it might be a library, it might be a history society, it might be an archive. They all function as an archive, but they call themselves different things. And anywhere you go, this is going to be typically a 3-part process. So I mentioned microfilm a little bit ago. Some people haven't seen actual microfilm. Depending on who's in the online audience and how young you are, you may or may not have ever seen a film strip in school. Most of the audience may have, if you're at least my age or older. And this is what microfilm looks like. It is basically, they take the item and they put it in a camera and they take a picture of the page. The microfilm in the picture happens to be newspaper pages, but you get the point. And these are, you have to page through frame by frame by frame. So, in real life, if you go to the probate court and you ask to see their big volume of indexing, you get an index and it has multiple parts to it. And this process is going to be the same if you are in real life in a book, if you are looking at it on microfilm, or if you are looking at it online in images that have not been transcribed. Ancestry, if it's on there, it's probably been indexed or transcribed. So you might have a shortcut there, but not everything's on Ancestry. Got a lot of records. So in this, at the front of the book, there's usually a page of instructions as to how to use that index. Sometimes they filmed it, sometimes they didn't. South Carolina, we're pretty, or at least Spartanburg County is pretty good that we have this direction page. And just because the directions say this is how the clerk is supposed to do this doesn't mean that clerk followed the directions. So you will see some variation in this, but you go from the sub-index, and this particular one is one that I have seen pretty widely across South Carolina. I've seen some very different ones in Virginia that make you guess what page you're on for the sub-index. That one's a lot of fun. But you go to the front part of the book and you go to the, okay, the name I want starts with an AD. It's Atkins. Okay. So you go through the list here in the part that has AD at the top here, and you go down and, oh, look, Adkins. Well, Adkins and Atkins are phonetically similar, and clerks spell them intermingled. Spelling is a 20th century invention. Unfortunately, it's going away in the 21st. So fuzzy thinking on how to group may be helpful. And it says, okay, page 17. So in the index, we go over to page 17. And there may be many pages of 17, 17A, 17B, 17C, etc., for very common surnames, because the index is covering, in this case, 1785 to 1919. Okay, long time period. So, 17A, we get both Adkins at the top and Atkins at the bottom. But again, look in both places, because that clerk could have written down what they were saying from what they heard, and literacy was not huge, and they might have gotten in the wrong bucket. And also, you will see that it tells us Green, Atkins, and they just break up the first names into sub-chunks of the alphabet for ease of scanning the page as you're looking through the index. The next name is Polly Atkins on this top line, and she is the administratrix. And it is file number 336 and August 10th, 1863. So that's when the probate file date is. Now, it could be the beginning date, the ending date, or some date in the middle of, but that is when they gave a date to this file. And look through. Usually the index goes from the earliest book to the more recent book in that, but sometimes they find that they missed one, so you find something for 1820 after 1900. So do take a look through and make sure you haven't missed your person. For each case, when you go to the next roll of film, so those first two things, the sub-index for names and the general index to the probate court, those are usually in one book or on one roll of film. Then we know we're looking for case 336 here. So we're going to go to Spartanburg County probate estate papers and look for case number 336. At the beginning of the filming, you will have Spartanburg County file number 336. At the end, it will say end of estate. So that can be really helpful. Estates can be short as one piece of paper, or they can be hundreds of pieces of paper. I think the longest one I personally have looked at was about 125, 130 pages. The guy had a half interest in a hotel, and they inventoried every single hotel room with a half interest in the bed, the linens, the soap holder, etc. It was intense, long, and a little bit unnecessary because they could have counted number of rooms and that many towel holders, that many whatever, but somebody was being very zealous in their duty of inventory, except that they skipped rooms because apparently they were occupied at that point. I don't know. Yeah, after a while it became a little absurd. But anyway, on this, you have loose papers that are in the file, and they have often been folded into 3 or 4 sections. And so on this is Green Atkins, that top person on that previous, that index page. And this is late enough that we have a form that they just fill in certain information. There's a number in the bottom left-hand corner that's a little hard to see, and I meant to blow up a little blow-up of it. But because these are loose papers, someone went through it in pencil, labeled them 336-1, 336-2, 336-3, etc. And that can help you track. But please note that they are not in this file in any particular order. So you may or may not find things in a logical sequence. Look through the whole file. Because sometimes the piece you need that starts the file is the last thing in the folder. So, and on the right-hand side here, you see, this is the back of this piece of paper, and you can see where it was folded. And you can see a little synopsis of what is contained on that document. So you have the name of the deceased, you have that Polly Atkins is the administratrix, and sometimes you have where that piece of paper was filed in the separate records. This is the document that formally gives Polly Atkins the administratrix role to administer the estate of her husband, Green Atkins, deceased. You get the name of the judge of the ordinary, one of the J. Earl Bomars. I think it was J. Can't remember. He went by Earl Bomars, who were judges. There were a number of them through the years. And the appointment, and you get also the appointment of the people who are supposed to assess and put a value on the personal and real property. So that is usually 3 people who are named by the court. They're usually from the neighborhood. And they go out and they're the ones who make this assessment of the property. They will list out how many beds, how many sets of bedclothes, what the dishes are, how many spinning wheels, how many plows, etc. And so the administratrix or administrator is not the person who does that. They are assessors who are named to do that. And those assessors may very well be your ancestor. And so they are inventorying the personal property. And so this is a close-up of that bottom part of that page that it says that, let's see, who is it? Polly Atkins, her mark, somebody Tinsley, and William Staggs. And so sometimes the administratrix or administrator is one of the people doing the valuation, but there's usually three, and always at least a couple are not associated directly with the process. And there's witness, who is an Adkins, so who knows? Now, you also get some interesting things in these probate files. On the left, you see a bill of boarding for Polly Atkins. So apparently after Green died, she didn't go to live with a child or anybody. She boarded with a neighbor, and they are charging the estate room and board for her expenses. And so that bill is in here. And then there is a request to sell personal property to free up some actual hard money. And so the judge has to approve that, and has to approve the inventory, and has to approve the sale. They also have to submit a plan for the division of the estate. So, always a good thing to have. And there's a petition for the final settlement. So they said, here is the plan. These people get these items or this amount of value of the property. Sometimes it is named out piece by piece of, my daughter Mary gets the bedstead from her room, or those types of things. My wife has access to these things, her third. And then after her death, these go to these children or grandchildren. Sometimes everything's going to be sold, and the division is third to the spouse, the remaining 2/3 divided equally among the children. Again, not necessarily standard, and it depends on if you have a valid will, as opposed to being subject to the law of the place at that time, which you may not want child number 4, with whom you've had a spat since they were a teenager, to get anything. But if you didn't write a will and exclude them, then they get their 6th or whatever, however many children divided by, the amount, they get their share by law if you don't specify. So sometimes you see specifications that so-and-so gets $1, so they can't complain they didn't get anything, but they got that $1. But it may also say they get $1 now because they received XYZ already. So sometimes it's not somebody being petty. Sometimes they've already given them gifts as they got started. As the older children got started in life and got married, they were gifted land or property or whatever, whereas the younger children are still under 21 and have not received that, or have not married and haven't received. And so they get the larger share of the current estate. And then, as I said, some of these go on for a number of years. 1863 is when we started this one. And, but they have a yearly accounting. This is actually the accounting for 1862. So it's like taxes. You have to account for that prior fiscal year and say what income came in, what income went out. A lot of the times, these people in Spartanburg County were farmers. And so you had to wait until the crop came in and you sold the crop to actually be able to settle any of the estate. So probate generally takes a year these days, and it may be at least a year. but they want to give time for things to settle. The bill of sale, these are the things on the right-hand side in this page that were sold and who they were sold to at the estate sale, at the auction. So you may find your people buying their neighbor's stuff, or you may find family members buying things either to return to the widow, in some cases, like her clothing, or you may find, the proceeds, they're just going to highest bidder. So sometimes you can put pieces of who the people in the neighborhood were from these sales. There may be easier ways to do it, but it's kind of interesting. This is the inventory on the left of the personal property. And I literally, these are in order of appearance. I just didn't do all the backs of the pages for all of them. It's not the order that they were created, it's just the order they got filmed. And then the settlement of the estate tells us who got what, how much each person inherited. And the court had to give permission for the sale to happen. So the court's giving permission because they have to make sure that the process of the law was followed. And then you will also find rejected claims against the estate. If somebody says, well, Green Atkins owed me money, but they can't prove that Green Atkins actually owed them money, then the judge is going to throw that out and say, you don't have proof, you don't have the receipt. Go about your way. But in some of these, you will also find newspaper clippings, and you will see when you do newspaper searches, clippings of or notices put in, legal notices put in the paper saying, if you have just debts against the estate of name of person deceased, please contact the court or contact the administrator to file those. And so at different times in different places, the number of notices, where you have to put those notices, whether it's in one paper or 3 or 4 papers, how far the geographic distance might be, depending on if there is a local paper or not a local paper. But you will sometimes find those legal notices. They still happen. We just don't really, some of them are online as much as anything else now, but you still have to post a legal notice. So just like property listings are still in the newspaper, these are going to be found there. It won't be terribly informative most of the time, but if it goes to Chancery or Equity Court, you may find the list of these heirs versus these heirs, because it's not that they're necessarily fighting, but they are having to divide up the stuff, and people who are over 21 don't want to have to wait until that 2-year-old is 21 to get their inheritance. I don't blame them. So how do they equitably divide that? And that's what the Chancery Court and Equity Court will work through. A different example, this is slightly earlier. And so this is actually slightly later, but anyway. Probate case 1259, I think it gets settled earlier. And this is on index page 65A, up at the top right corner there. And I'm looking at John Simon Linder, who I forgot to put my little green arrow on this. It's one of the lines in this. But probate case 1259, on the left, you see a handwritten copy of his will, which is nigh unto illegible. It's pretty, but not very decipherable handwriting. On the right-hand side, there is a typed transcript that was done by workers for the Works Progress Administration in the 1930s during the Great Depression, one of the New Deal agencies. Came through here and they transcribed a bunch of the wills. Some of the transcriptions are fine. Some of the transcriptions are not accurate. So take it with a grain of salt, take it as a hint. try to go to the original document if it still exists and read for yourself, because sometimes things get missed. But having the typed ones is certainly a helpful shortcut to tell you where to look for the original. And so this John Simon Linder died testate. He has a will. It was filed, and in the file we have both handwritten and typed copies of the will. So you never know what you're going to find. One of the other things that we find in this file is you see these lovely page breaks in the middle. Because these pages are folded in the file, the pages weakened at that point with closing and opening and closing and opening. Sometimes there is very little information lost. You can just put those two pieces together, or you could if you were looking at the original, but you can't on microfilm. Other times you're missing a line of text, and of course that's going to be the one that you need. So, you know, it's just something to consider. Sometimes you get the most literate, but not the best handwriting person, or not even the most literate person, but the person who could read and write and had a little time and got appointed. This one, the handwriting is not particularly great. So, good luck with that and ask a friend. But hey, we've got the information there. So, this was found, I believe, on Ancestry, but these are wills in a North Carolina book, so they have been transcribed and typed into the clerk's book. And this is another place where watch out for transcription errors. Watch out for typing errors, because they didn't have spell check. They didn't have autocorrect or auto uncorrect, depending on what you're typing. Know that this is at least the third generation of the text. So the original text, the clerk's handwritten copy, and now this typed copy. So again, look for one of those previous versions and make sure that all of them agree on the primary points of the document. And there may have been even more versions. I looked at a chancery case in Virginia. Well, actually multiple chancery cases on the same situation, because that gentleman did not limit the spouse's life interest if she remarried, and she remarried 3 times. And it took about 50 years for that case to actually get settled. And the other heirs kept having to take her back to Chancery Court to contest how she was handling things. And so it's just one of those situations where I have now seen 4 copies of that person's will within the original will files. Within 3 of them are handwritten by the same clerk's hand on the same type of paper with the same special ink. And man, that was a good clerk of court, because they're virtually identical, but it's well prior to photocopiers. So just know, clerk copies are only as good as the clerk, and depending on how many times they got distracted during the copying of that document when they were asked to provide it to the other court. It's kind of interesting. So, some will examples. Again, the handwritten on the left is a transcription into the court record from the handwritten will. And the typed on the right is actually a transcription from the court's transcription. And the one on the right is actually kind of interesting. This one is on South Carolina Department of Archives and History's webpage and their online digitized documents. I was trying to figure out who Amy Pittman's husband was. This is my 4th great grandmother. And I think I have mostly figured it out, but not absolutely, convinced, but in 1848, he has a will. And as you see, it's a pretty long will. It names all of the children, and it names which of her personal property enslaved persons were to go to which children and grandchildren. Women could own personal property at that point in South Carolina. They could not own real property. So real estate and personal property are two different things. So a woman could own an enslaved person, a horse, sometimes even a house. They just couldn't own the land on it that it was on, or it could be held in trust for them. So, still working on that one. But it was fascinating, and I found it because I was searching the online records on the Department of Archives and History site for her daughter and son-in-law. And because her daughter is inheriting, but she's the wife of the son-in-law, because he's the one who could legally manage her property for her in 1848 in South Carolina, they are both named. But it proves their marriage, and it proves who her mother was, and it proves that a brother was living in Mississippi. So I've got to research the Mississippi records to see if I can find where that land was in Mississippi. Problem is, it's a rather common, it was William Pittman. There are numerous William Pittmans. So anyway, some places make you hunt. In South Carolina, they pull everything into a single probate packet. And so you get all these little pieces of paper about the administrator and sometimes you get the guardianship of children and various things in this whole packet. Other places like Georgia and North Carolina, you get to go to the Book of Administration, and then you get to go to the Book of Guardianships, and then you get to go to the Will Book, and then you get to go to the listings of the inventories, and then and appraisals. I think you get both of those in the same book. And then you get to go to the final settlements in a different book. It's different places, which just makes it that much more fun when one of those books has disappeared. But in Bibb County, Georgia, in the Court of the Ordinary, so that's a different court name than the probate court or the orphans court, etc. We have down here this the estate of Anna Thompson, who my second great grandmother's sister, we think, except for she may only be a half sister. On her death certificate, it doesn't name the mama that I was expecting. It names another woman, but it names the daddy. But the woman who raised her is my third great grandmother. So anyway, research continues. That's the one that any piece of information brings up 15 more questions. Everybody has at least one of those lines. But between 1929 and 1931, you would have to go to these various different books. And so there's a letter, which is a temporary letter of administration, the petition for the temporary letter of administration, the petition to probate a will, the will book, common form, the petition for the letters of dismission, and the letters of dismission. So you get the whole process there. You just have to go to multiple places to look for it. So, and it was actually finalized in 1941. Started in 1929. Ended in 41. So again, this tells you sometimes these take longer than you think they're going to. If you are looking for enslaved persons, and if you are looking for women, you have to generally look at the men in their lives. This is an 1810 Marion County, I think. And it's Joseph Bass, late of Marion County, deceased. and it's the appraisement of the goods, chattels, rights, and credits. So he died circa 1810. This list was put together around 1840 after his wife died, his widow died, because she had life interest in the property unless she remarried. So she had the right to live on part of the property and used part of the income from that property for the remainder of her life. So I have abstracted some of the lines here, and they go as follows. One lot of Negroes, say 14 head, $3,500. One lot of cattle, say 51 head, $230. One lot of horses, say 11 head, $700. One rocking chair, $60. So it is inventorying and aggregating what the estate had. There's also a lot of flax for $1. So varying amounts, obviously 14 head of enslaved laborers for $3,500 is a huge chunk of this particular estate. And then the land, of course, that all of these people worked. This one is this is my fifth great grandfather, John Bethea, also down in the Marion County area. He died around 1820. His son Elisha, who inherited a good chunk of the land and the enslaved, was apparently running the plantation for his father at that point. He was not married at that time and had no legal heirs, and they are at pains to say no legal heirs. So there may be other cousins out there that are just not legally recognized. So African-American Betheas, we need to look at that DNA. But this will goes through and painfully goes through all of the things that here Elisha is getting this, but if he has no legal heirs at the time he dies, then this is what's going to happen to all of that property, all of that stuff. And then lists all of the other heirs. Now, only the names of the two sons-in-law are mentioned, but not the daughters' names. So sometimes you have to imply the daughters from, if someone is inheriting and it doesn't specifically say my son-in-law, but the surname is different, start with the thought that's probably a son-in-law and work out if there are daughters, can you work from other sources to combine and figure out who's related to whom? Occasionally you have a stepson in there who's inheriting, something like that. And the people who are really good at writing wills will write the relationships for you. My daughter, Martha, her husband, Joe. I mean, sometimes you get lucky. Sometimes you have to read between the lines and put pieces together. So, however, one of the things, doesn't name his daughters, but it named every one of the enslaved by first name and in family groupings. So, sometimes you get those little pieces of gold in the midst of difficult reading in our ancestors' lives. A few things to remember. In South Carolina, dower right of women stayed active as a law far longer than it did in many states. Next month in deed records, we're going to see that all the way up through 1985, we got some dower rights going on. So, dower right typically meant a 1/3 life interest in any property, real or personal, but not the right to then bequeath that property. So if you see a woman like Amy Pittman bequeathing personal property, she has inherited that likely from her father, her brother, her grandfather, or her mother. It's likely been managed by the men in her life, but it is her property. If she remarried, she lost the dower rights unless the will specified otherwise. Normally it says my wife, whoever, to inherit 1/3 life interest in unless she remarries. If they leave out that unless she remarries, it's until she dies. That's where we get the situation where people kept having to take them to Chancery Court in Virginia through the early half of the 1800s because of mismanagement. And then she married an abolitionist, which was the nail in the coffin for some of the inheritors. So know that women could be named as the owner, they just couldn't manage their own property unless they were femme sole, and that's a different program. Femme sole means a woman acting on her own behalf, not femme covert, meaning she is one with her husband's identity. So sometimes a woman owned a business, there was a legal process to keep her husband's hands out of that money. Sometimes it didn't matter, but there were processes. Again, if you are looking at enslaved and women, you will see dower rights listed. This is 1830 in Virginia. And unfortunately, it just says my wife and my children. It doesn't name them. Happen to know that this James Taylor was the first husband of Esther Boggs, who then married my George Turner. And in George Turner's will, there are divisions, including some property for the Taylor children that he had been holding because she married him. But he was at pains to make sure that they were being divided out to the proper heirs. So, after those children, of course, were 21. Things to remember. Enslaved African Americans were considered to be personal property, and they were listed on estate accountings prior to emancipation. Not all of these lists survive. Not all of them have names or ages or other identifying information. But if you are looking for Bessie the cook, you might get lucky. Always pays to read what you can. And if you can trace inheritance from person to person to person, that can be really helpful if you are researching the enslaved. Check the adjacent counties or where children were living in case the person moved shortly before death. Just like today, sometimes somebody moves in with their kids and they might not be on this side of the line. They might be in Rutherford County, North Carolina, rather than Spartanburg County, South Carolina, when they were in Campobello or Lathrop or wherever. If there is no significant real or personal property, then there's less likely to be a will or probate, just because, unless, of course, there was significant death, and then they would try. If there is a trust that has been set up, and this is more modern for more people, my mother has a trust set up, and that will largely circumvent probate records, because the trust will just divide between my brother and myself and come to us, and it will be done. As long as once her debts are settled. But it's a different legal process that is a little bit more opaque than the general probate. I mean, you still have to go through rigmarole to get to probate, but it's public record. Trusts are not necessarily public record. Also, do check wills and probate for in-laws, step-parents, particularly stepfathers, and maternal grandparents or maternal siblings, aunts, uncles, etc. Because you may find great aunt Jean, who had no children of her own, leaving this, that, and the other to her favorite great nieces and nephews. So that can be really helpful because often with those relationships, they will line out how the relationship happens. Now, just saying, sometimes people left things to people completely unrelated to them. And there's no anything that you can do to prove a relationship if they weren't actually related. So, also, some people dispersed their property before they died. So check for deeds transferring land or enslaved people to heirs at the time they got married, at the time of a birth of a child. And, you know, sometimes if someone was old and infirm, they went ahead and transferred their property out to their children and went to live with one or more of the children. Sometimes they moved around from child to child. So do look at the records and see what you can get. Now, records of the enslaved probably were not indexed in most of the various court records. They may exist in the court records, but they're not there in the indexing because the indexing was done in the 20th century largely. And why did we need to know about that? That's not currently relevant. Was the decision making? It's something we need to sweep under the rug. Luckily, they didn't cut it out of the books, but it's not indexed, so it's harder to find, but you may find some stuff if you are researching descendants of the enslaved. Thank you for coming. Are there questions? And I'm clicking to see if I can get my chat up. Okay. While I'm doing that, in the room, people, anybody have a question in here? Okay. Keep thinking of topics for February through June. Okay, I see a question here that is how to research ancestors from other countries that speak languages other than English. You may want to hire a researcher who's fluent in that language or that area to research. It's not going to be necessarily cheap, but if you don't speak German and you need in-depth German record research, there are some things, marriage forms, baptism forms, death registers that are going to be standard grid forms that you fill in, and you can kind of figure out whether it means mother, father, and the name, dates, that kind of thing. Google Translate can do fairly well with those if you can translate it into text, modern text. But yeah, language barriers can be an issue. Now, those who work in archives in places other than America often do speak 3, 4, 5, 7 languages and are fluent in them. So they may be able to take a request in English, find the records, and send the record and a brief translation for you. But I would not count on that, and I would send them an extra gift afterward if they do that. But yeah, there are researchers who specialize in various areas and languages, and you might want to talk to one of them just because, yeah, the language barrier is an issue. Okay.
Do you see
what
the
else
next
do
question?
I see? Okay, secret for the handout. And okay, how do you register a will? You take the will to the probate court, to the probate court office, the clerk of court's office, and you say, I need to start a probate. I need to register a will. And they will do that at that office, at least in South Carolina. If you're in a different state, your mileage may vary on that, but usually it's whoever handles probate will also handle pre-filing of wills. If you want to pre-file it, both of you, if you know you're going into hospice or something and you want to go ahead and file it, so it's there. you know, the attorney who will help you do a will, can also make sure that process is done, or they hold it until that such time as you die, and then they will do that on behalf of the family. So it depends on where it is. So, okay. Best course of action in researching African American families. Well, you start out 20th century like everybody else, same resources, etc. And then you do have to start looking at the post-Civil War in the South, Freedmen's Bureau records for labor contracts, and marriage registrations and things. Pre-emancipation, you're going to have to be looking at where you think they lived, what estate they were on, and hope for listings in estate records like we're talking tonight, but also plantation records or farm records, diaries of the owners, etc. So on the YouTube page at the library where this will be archived, hopefully by the end of the week, there's a presentation on finding plantation records that may be helpful as well. So, are there other questions, Cheryl? Did I get all the questions?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I just put my own suggestion on there about, I don't know whether or not this would be useful, but a Zoom presentation on how to use our new database, the Newsbank.
Oh, okay.
Or any of the stuff that we have.
That could be a good February or March or whenever presentation. Very good. Well, I'm going to ask Cheryl to go ahead and stop the recording. And then if anybody has